Chapter 1. The Arrival.
Julia stepped out of the taxi, the cold air wrapping around her like a shroud. She gazed up at the old hotel, its weathered facade adorned with intricate woodwork and a fading sign that read, "The Water's Edge Inn." The allure of its history called to her, pulling her forward despite the peculiar chill that seemed to emanate from the building. As she approached the entrance, the creaking of the wooden steps broke the otherwise serene silence. The air was thick with a sense of forgotten stories, and Julia felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. She had come here seeking inspiration, hoping to capture the essence of the place in her art. Little did she know, inspiration was not the only thing waiting for her. Upon entering, a delightful bell jingled softly, announcing her arrival. A woman in her 60s emerged from behind the reception desk, a warm smile playing on her lips. "Welcome to the Water's Edge, dear. I'm Mrs. Thompson. What brings you here?" "I'm an artist," Julia replied, feeling both nervous and energized. "I'm hoping to find some inspiration." "Ah, you'll find plenty here," Mrs. Thompson said, her eyes twinkling mysteriously. "But be prepared. This place has its secrets. Some guests leave with more than just memories." Julia nodded, a sense of curiosity piquing within her. As Mrs. Thompson handed her the key to room 203, Julia's fingers brushed against the cool metal. It felt oddly significant, as if it held the power to unlock hidden truths. With a final glance at Mrs. Thompson, Julia made her way down the dimly lit hallway, her heart racing with both anticipation and a hint of trepidation. Little did she know, the secrets of the Water's Edge Inn were about to unfold in ways she could never imagine.
Chapter 2. The First Signs.
After settling into her room, Julia felt a wave of inspiration wash over her. The quaint little space was decorated with vintage furniture and framed photographs of past guests, a glimpse into lives once lived within these walls. She spent the afternoon painting, but as the hours wore on, fatigue settled in. Frustrated, she set her brush down and decided to take a break. Pushing herself away from the easel, Julia decided to explore the hotel, hoping to clear her mind. The old wooden floors creaked beneath her as she wandered through the dimly lit hallways. Eventually, she was drawn to the back of the hotel, where a lush garden led to the reservoir. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air enveloped her, refreshing and invigorating. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow on the still water. Approaching the edge, she peered into the depths, her heart pounding with anticipation. Suddenly, a startling sight caught her attention. There, beneath the water's surface, she could make out what appeared to be a body, a woman floating eerily still. Julia's breath hitched in her throat, her instincts screaming at her to look away. The contours of the figure were hauntingly beautiful, yet disconcertingly lifeless. Julia stumbled backward, her heart racing as waves of shock washed over her. Was it a trick of the light? Or had she truly witnessed something grim and unsettling? Fear clawed at her, and she turned, hastily retreating back into the comforting familiarity of the hotel. The icy grip of dread settled over her as she grappled with the implications of what she had seen, her mind racing with questions that begged to be answered.
Chapter 3. Stories of the Past.
The next morning, Julia awoke with an unsettling sense of dread lingering over her. The image of the woman in the reservoir haunted her thoughts, and sleep had eluded her. Determined to shake off the unease, she headed down to the lobby, where the soft glow of sunlight filtered through the windows, creating a warm atmosphere. Mrs. Thompson stood behind the reception desk, her usual warm smile momentarily faltering as she noticed the distress on Julia's face. "Good morning, dear. You look like you've seen a ghost. Is everything all right?" Julia hesitated, but ultimately decided to share her experience. I think I saw something in the water last night. A woman. It didn't look real." Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted, a shadow flickering in her eyes. "The reservoir has seen much sorrow, my dear. There are stories about guests who have disappeared over the years, mysterious circumstances that often remain unexplained." Intrigued, Julia pressed for more details. "What happened to them?" "Some come seeking refuge, but they find themselves lost in the whispers of the past," Mrs. Thompson explained cryptically. "This hotel holds memories that refuse to fade, and sometimes the waters reflect more than just the environment." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. "Have you ever found anyone?" "No," Mrs. Thompson replied softly, sadness creeping into her voice. "But their stories linger, waiting for someone to uncover the truth." Determined to understand the mysteries surrounding the hotel, Julia decided to delve deeper into its history. Gathering her courage, she made her way to the hotel library, hoping to find records or accounts of the past guests, their lives, their disappearances, and the truth behind the shadows that loomed over the water's edge inn.
Chapter 4. The Diary.
The library was a small, dimly lit room filled with dusty books and an air of neglect. Julia stepped inside, the musky scent of aged paper wafting around her. She ran her fingers along the spines, feeling the weight of countless stories waiting to be uncovered. The sunlight filtered in through a tall window, illuminating a long table piled high with read and unread materials. As she began to sift through the stacks, Julia stumbled upon an old, leather-bound diary hidden beneath a disheveled pile of books. The cover was worn, and the pages yellowed with age. Her heart raced with excitement as she carefully opened it, revealing handwritten entries filled with both grace and anguish. The diary belonged to a woman named Clara, a guest at the water's edge in over 50 years ago. The dates taunted Julia, each entry pulsating with the emotional weight of isolation and despair. As she read, Clara's words transported Julia to a time lost, where the shadows of the past intertwined with her own experience. Clara described her fascination with the reservoir and her unsettling encounters with figures beneath the surface. Each entry grew more frantic as Clara's mental state deteriorated, mentioning voices whispering in the dark and visions of a drowned woman who seemed to plead for release. Julia felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as if Clara was recounting her own experiences. The final entry sent chills cascading through Julia. "I fear the waters have claimed my spirit. If anyone finds this, know that I am not alone. We are all trapped here, forever reflected in the depths." Closing the diary, Julia's mind raced. Clara's fate was not just a tale from the past. It felt eerily relevant to her own journey. Determined to piece together the chilling puzzle, Julia could not shake the feeling that she was being pulled deeper into the shadows of the water's edge.
Chapter 5. Confrontation with the Past.
With Clara's chilling diary clutched tightly in her hands, Julia felt a wave of determination wash over her. She needed to confront not only the mysteries of the hotel, but also the fears that had begun to entwine themselves within her. Julia decided to seek out Mrs. Thompson, hoping to share what she had discovered. Finding the receptionist tucked away in the cozy lobby, Julia rushed over. "Mrs. Thompson, I think what I saw last night, the body in the reservoir, it might be connected to a guest who disappeared years ago." Mrs. Thompson looked up from her desk, a shadow crossing her features. "What do you mean, dear? Are you sure it wasn't just a trick of the light?" Frustration bubbled within Julia. "It's not just my imagination. I found Clara's diary. She experienced the same thing I did. What if there's something more here?" Mrs. Thompson's gaze softened as she leaned closer. "Child, the waters here hold many secrets. It's easy to get lost in stories, but they often reflect our own fears." Julia felt her heart race. She couldn't let doubt or hesitation hold her back. She had to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the darkness that surrounded her.
Chapter 6. The Ritual.
The tension in the air was palpable as Julia shared the details of Clara's diary with Mrs. Thompson. The older woman listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. "You must be aware of the risks, Julia," she said softly. "The water has a history that should not be trifled with." "I have to try," Julia replied, her voice steady. "There's a ritual described in the diary, something that could release the lost souls trapped in the reservoir. If I don't do this, I fear I may end up like Clara." Mrs. Thompson hesitated, a flicker of worry dancing in her eyes. "The ritual is not something to take lightly. Each participant must confront their own darkness. Are you truly ready for that?" Julia nodded, determination firming within her. "I have to know the truth. It's the only way to regain my peace." Reluctantly, Mrs. Thompson agreed to help Julia prepare for the ritual. Together they gathered items from around the hotel: candles, incense, and a small bowl to hold the waters of the reservoir. As they prepared, Julia felt both excitement and fear swirling within her. She could sense that the moment of truth was approaching, and she was ready to face whatever lay beneath the surface.
Chapter 7. Reflections in the Water.
That night, Julia stood at the edge of the reservoir, the moonlight casting a silvery sheen across the surface. The air was thick with tension, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of night creatures. With Mrs. Thompson by her side, Julia felt a mix of fear and exhilaration as they prepared for the ritual. Clutching the diary tightly, she began to recite the incantation Clara had written. The words felt alive as they escaped her lips, resonating with the energy around her. Each syllable sent shivers down her spine, and Julia could almost feel the past stirring to life. As she finished the incantation, the water began to shimmer, and the once still surface started to ripple. Figures emerged beneath the depths, swirling in the moonlight as if time itself had bent and twisted. The shadows began to take form, revealing their ghostly figures, faces contorted with despair and loss. A chill swept through Julia as the manifestations grew clearer, sorrowful expressions pleading for release. Clara's voice echoed in her mind, "We are all trapped here." Julia's heart raced as she grappled with the magnitude of what she had awakened. Suddenly, one of the figures began to rise, its ethereal hand reaching towards her. The despair in its eyes mirrored Julia's own darkest fears, reflecting the pain she had buried deep within. At that moment, Julia realized that to free the lost souls, she would also need to confront her own inner turmoil. The line between her reality and the reflections in the water began to blur, pulling her deeper into the past.
Chapter 8. Liberation and Consequences.
As the figure's outstretched hand reached for Julia, an overwhelming wave of emotion surged through her. With a deep breath, she faced the phantom, allowing herself to feel the pain and fear she had long suppressed. The waters began to churn violently, and the other spirits drifted closer, drawn by her acceptance. In that moment of clarity, Julia recited the final words of the incantation, calling upon the depths to release them. A blinding light erupted from the reservoir, engulfing her senses. As the figures ascended, their expressions shifted from sorrow to peace. Julia emerged from the water, forever changed, the weight of her past finally lifted.
Chapter 9. The Legacy.
With the last traces of the supernatural light fading into the night, Julia stood by the reservoir, drenched and dazed. But the weight of relief was overshadowed by the unsettling presence of Mrs. Thompson, who watched her with a stormy expression that was difficult to decipher. Anger flickered in her eyes, clouds of discontent swirling within. As dawn broke on the horizon and cast golden rays over the water, Julia felt a mixture of gratitude and confusion. The figures were gone, their anguish released, yet she stood puzzled by the change in Mrs. Thompson's demeanor. Without warning, Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice low and venomous. "You had no right to meddle with what you didn't understand." In a sudden, fierce motion, she pushed Julia towards the reservoir. "No, Wait! Julia gasped, plunging into the cold water, panic rising within her. But as she resurfaced, fighting to regain her breath, the shadowy figures reappeared, swirling with renewed energy. Rather than succumb to despair, Julia felt the connection surge within her, as their pain echoed her own. This time, she would confront not only the spirits but also the anger that had manifested in Mrs. Thompson. Unlocking her own strength, she recited the incantation once more, igniting her own power in defiance.